Hi, Corey. So we're starting to get a few people into our class, which is good. And while we're waiting, is there anybody that has any questions? Nobody has any questions?
No.
No. Okay, so that means we know everything. I don't need to say anything at all tonight. I'm going to go ahead and then sign off. Right, Jamie? Okay.
Not saying that, but I don't have a question that pops out right now.
All right, so it's just a little bit before 7. What I'd like to do in a minute is let the rest of these people in, and then right at 7 o'clock we'll get started. So what we're what we're going to do is talk a little bit about tonight's lab, and then we will discuss the final practical, which I'm actually making up, and will be multiple choice and true false. So that'll make it easier on you as well as myself. So tonight we're going to talk about lab 10, and lab 10 deals with the neuron and the nervous system. So I happen to have brought a couple models with me. And so what I will do at first is bring this model that I have right here. This is a reflex arc, is what it actually is. And what we're going to be looking at when we look over here, basically, this is a sensory neuron. And sensory neurons are unipolar neurons. And if you notice, there's like one arm, and the cell body or nucleus is off to the side. So think of that as just a unipolar. So if they ask a question, sensory neurons are unipolar type neurons, you would say yes. And so this is actually a reflex arc. So in other words, if I tap a tendon or if I stick a pin in the skin, there's sensory receptors that will pick up the signal and carry this signal towards the cell body is basically what it's actually doing. So dendrites, this is the dendrite carrying the action potential towards the cell body. And so basically carrying the signal away, once you get to the cell body, away is the axon. So you have a sheet for tonight on the material, and it wants you to describe the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon. So the dendrites, let's use this neuron here. This is actually a multipolar. This is a multipolar neuron. It's a motor neuron. And you've actually been introduced to this when we were talking about muscles. And remember, we had a neuromuscular junction. Here's the muscle, and this is the axon, and this would be the motor end plate. Recall that? And we would send a signal from the presynapse to the sarcolemma and actually get an action potential. So in other words, this is a multipolar neuron is what we have here. So notice how small the dendrites are as far as length. And so in your notes, it says dendrites receive stimuli from a sensory receptor or another nerve and carry it basically to the cell body. So the cell body is here. So this is a long axon. So in your spinal column, you're going to have long axons that will be carrying a signal, let's say, to various parts of the body. We want to also talk a little bit about what the cell body does. So in other words, if we're looking here, the cell body is the nucleus. It'll control the cell. And it is where we're going to actually have all the different organelles that we talked about that are in cells, like mitochondria. Remember, we had those there as well. Between the different type of nerves is a synapse or gap called a synaptic cleft. And so we will have, let me just set this down. We will have a junction between the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane. On the presynaptic membrane, you'll have little vesicles that are going to carry acetylcholine, called a neurotransmitter. and then it has to cross the gap. And on the postsynapse, there's going to be like a little catcher's, think of it like a little catcher's glove. And this acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, will sit in that little glove, and it'll create, if you get enough of those occurring, it'll create what's called an action potential. Let me let some more people in now that we're at 7:03. So let's talk a little bit about axons. Axons generate what's called an action potential. And so what I have here is, this is a model of a motor neuron or a multipolar neuron. These are the dendrites going into the cell body, and this would be the axon that would be leaving, and this portion over here would connect on here. So the dendrites are carrying the signal towards the cell body, and then basically carrying the signal away from the cell body is the axon. And on this area here, we have several things I'd like to talk a little bit about. This little junction is called the axon hillock. It's a trigger zone, and it'll cause an action potential that will occur that'll cause the propagation of a nerve impulse through this axon. So what you're looking at here in the middle is the axon, but it's surrounded by insulation, and it's a Schwann cell. So the Schwann cell wraps around and allows for a faster conduction. There will be little areas in here where there's a lack of myelin. And looking at this board, you'll notice that up in here, there's a lack of myelin. And then on the axons, there's lack of myelin. That's called the node of Ranvier. And the type of action potential that occurs here is called saltatory. It's a very fast movement of an impulse where it'll jump. So it'll jump from one node of Ranvier to the next and work its way real rapidly. And so the purpose of the node of Ranvier is to have a faster conduction. So the myelin sheath that we have, that is this area right in here, is called a Schwann cell if the nerve is out in the peripheral part of the body. If it's actually in the central nervous system, it has a different name. It's called an oligodendrocyte. But we need to know Schwann cell. You also need to know that's an axon. You need to know the area where there's lack of covering node of Ranvier. And if you look on end, this axon has a Schwann cell, and then on the outer part is the wrapping around an individual axon. That's called an endoneurium. So what I did was I brought some pencils. So if you look in face on a pencil, think of the lead as the axon and the wood as being the endoneurium. And if we were to bring a group of these together, a group of axons together, we're going to call a group of these a fascicle. And so around each individual axon is endoneurium. Around the group of them, or fascicles, is called what? Perineurium. Remember we had perimycium in muscle? Well, we're doing the same thing. So if I have a group of one nerve and let's say another group of another nerve, and wrapping around all of these bundles, this would be a perineurium here and perineurium here, but around all of it would be an epineurium. So we have different layers, just like what we had before when we were talking about muscles. Okay, let's go and take a look on your sheet that we're going to be using. Let me let one more person in. Let's go over the matching that we have for neurons and neuroglia. So in other words, when we look at an axon, we said an axon conducts action potential away. So the one that does that was what? Number C, or letter C? C, okay. Yeah. Dendrite is, let's take a look. Dendrite, receptor region of neuron that produces graded potential. Well, we really haven't talked about it, but let's talk about it now. Where the dendrites are, we have what are called local or graded potential. And if you see all these different connections, so these are other nerves let's say, axon going into the dendrites that's going into the cell body. Some of these may have a positive stimulation and some may have a negative. So when you think about grading, if some of them are positive and some are negative, whatever's in the majority will determine whether that nerve is going to fire. Okay. So let's think of a spider. Let's say, you know, I have a spider on my hand, and the first time I see a spider on my hand, what am I going to do with it? Probably not smack it, but do what? Shoot away or move my arm, right? Because I'm afraid. But if I see that there's a spider and I know it's not going to hurt me, I've gotten to a point where I've been able to, you know, recognize that this is something that's not going to hurt me. And so I'm not going to go ahead and throw, you know, or move my arm real rapidly. So in that case, maybe there's more inhibitory stimulation than excitatory type stimulation. So if you think about it, graded means that in order for threshold, you have to have a high enough number of positive stimuli to make this nerve fire. And so nerves have an all or none type of response. So they either fire or they don't fire, okay? So let's see what else we want to talk a little bit about on our matching. So we have dendrite as G, receptor region of the neuron that produces a graded or local potential. And then the cell body, let's see, what do we have for that? That would be D, right? Site of nucleus and where the metabolism is. And node of Ranvier, gaps in myelin sheath A, where depolarization occurs, right? And it's called saltatory conduction. So you want to know that. And then the myelin is an insulation. So myelin number 5 is B, increases conduction rate. And the Schwann cell is E, produces the myelin sheath. And the axon terminal would be H, contains the synaptic vesicles with neurotransmitters. And let me let someone else in. Okay. And then the last one is the trigger zone or axon hillock, and that would be F, site of an action potential generation. So if you look at this model basically shows the axon hillock right here, or the trigger zone. And let's make sure. So it says the myelin sheath would be this area over here. The dendrites are this area. That's obviously the cell body. That'd be the cell body. The axon is this one here, and then it's cut, but it's also connected over here so that you can actually see. And then there's a node of Ranvier. And then we have the Schwann cell. That's the Schwann cell here wrapping around. It makes the myelin sheath. And then endoneurium around each axon inside, remember that's the endoneurium. So this outer part is the endoneurium, okay? So this gives us some understanding of the different parts of a neuron. And so you got dendrite, cell body, and axon. Let me go back to the first board. This first board, let's take a look again at it, has two types of neuron. Well, we're gonna name some of these neurons by what they do and then what type of nerve they are. So in other words, this is unipolar or sensory, carrying information basically in towards the cell body. And we're going to learn next week that there's going to be a group of the cell bodies, the sensory cell bodies, called a ganglion, and that'll be found outside the spinal cord. And then this part would actually go into the spinal cord. So if this is the dendrite and axons are going away, this little space in here is the synapse where you have two different nerves coming together. So we need to send a signal with a transmitter, again, acetylcholine. This is called an interneuron or association neuron. Interneuron because what? It's between the unipolar and this multipolar over here. So it's called an association neuron or interneuron. And then this multipolar will pick up the signal if enough stimulation occurs through the dendrites, And then at the axon hillock, it'll cause an action potential, and then it'll go through the axon. And as we already saw with muscles, I stimulate a gland or the muscle with an axon, and we do that with the neurotransmitters from the presynaptic membrane. Okay. Is there any questions on this so far? Okay, this is called a reflex. And let me go over this now, because typically I always like to ask a question about what are the 5 parts of a reflex arc. And it's not listed in today's lab, but we'll be getting into it probably in 11. And I'm already making the final practical. So what I did is took the photos in your lab 10, and then the information from the sheets, and I've asked questions. So if you want to start studying for the final, what you need to do is have more than just an understanding. Make sure that you can go ahead and follow along, for instance, that an axon carries an action potential where? Away from the cell body, whereas a dendrite carries it towards. Okay, that's all in your notes. Okay, and so basically, 5 parts of the reflex arc are sensory receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron or association neuron, motor neuron, and an effector or a muscle. So let me go over those again. Just listen. It'll be written down, but I'm just trying to give you this information while we have the board. Sensory receptor, sensory neuron, association or interneuron, motor neuron, and effector is either a gland or a muscle. So those are your 5 different parts of a reflex arc. So what is a reflex? If I were to take a hammer and hit my bicep, it would make my arm jerk. So in other words, I would have to have a sensory receptor. I'd have to have a sensory neuron going up into the spinal cord. I'd have to have an interneuron or association neuron. I'd have to stimulate the motor neuron. The axon of the motor neuron would stimulate the muscle, and then my muscle would jump. So those are the 5 parts. Okay. All right. On the bottom of page, well, first of all, let's go on the bottom of page 1. It wants to know different types of conductions, and it's taken directly from your notes. So if we take a look at it, it says saltatory conduction will occur where? It will occur at the node of Ranvier. And that's where the stimulation jumps. So that's node of Ranvier. Continuous conduction would be at the dendrites. And that's how in the dendrite, how the stimulation moves through the dendrites. So continuous, you're going to find this in your notes. It's going to be in the dendrites. Graded, or notice it says local potential, is also at the dendrite. And this is how it receives stimulation. So there's 2 things. Think of what the dendrite does. It has to receive stimulation, and once it receives stimulation, it sends that stimulation where? To the cell body. So basically what you're having is graded potential out in the dendrites, and then the dendrites are long. They're going to think of my let's say the palm here or the back of my hand as the cell body. So it'll have to pick up the stimuli, and then once it's done that would be a graded potential, and then send it as an action potential, and that's how it would stimulate. Basically, it would stimulate through the cell body to get to the axon hillock. So where it says graded or local, that's in the dendrite. Okay, and so it's receiving stimulation. And yet just above it, it says continuous conduction is also in the dendrite, and that's sending the signal through the cell body to the axon hillock or trigger zone. And then the action potential occurs in what's called the axon. So that's how I send a signal. So what we're doing is we're sending a signal from one part to another part. So maybe from one nerve to another nerve, and then to a muscle or to a gland. Okay. At the bottom of your first page, it has different terms. And one of them is presynaptic membrane. So at the neuromuscular junction, That's the presynaptic membrane. And if we look at the alphabetical, let's say, response that you would use for the matching, presynaptic membrane would be C, membrane that releases a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. So that's the presynaptic membrane. The neurotransmitter would be what? D. That's what? The chemical that carries the impulse across this gap. And then the cleft is A. It's just the space between two neurons or between a neuron and an organ like a muscle. And then the neurotransmitter receptor has to be not on the presynaptic membrane, but where? On the other one, the postsynaptic membrane. And think of it as a glove. Remember, the acetylcholine has to, fit in that receptor. And if it does that and enough of that occurs, then you get an action potential. So the postsynaptic membrane is B, and that's the membrane that contains the neurotransmitter receptor. And then the synaptic vesicles, or F, contain what's called a neurotransmitter. Okay? And so these are terms that there's a nice picture in your images that you can look at to see the pre and see the vesicles and see the acetylcholine, and then on the opposite side, the postsynaptic membrane. All right. Now we want to talk about the brain. And so I brought with me a model. This is a model of a brain. So if we look at it, it's going to have different lobes, and the lobes are named for the same parts of the skull. So regions of the skull that we had to learn was what? There was a frontal part, recall? Mm-hmm. There was frontal, and then on top was called parietal, and then in the back was called the occipital, and then where your ears were was on the side, and that was called temporal. So in other words, the various regions that we're going to talk about a frontal region, a parietal region, an occipital, and a temporal, okay? And so if we look at it, there are two hemispheres. So we can take our brain, you can't take your brain. Maybe I can get this part across, open, so that we can actually look inside, so we can see some of the different regions of the brain. Okay. So before we go ahead and show you the right side, this is the left side. This is the left outer side. Now, what's this down below? This area down below at the very bottom, if we turn it around, spinal cord. This is the spinal cord here. And so signals are coming from the body up into the brain, and from the brain going down into the body. So that's the spinal cord. And then there's an area where it actually is oblong, O-B-L-O-N-G. And so it's not evenly, it doesn't have even sides. It's kind of like wider. So it's called the medulla oblongata. It's oblong. And that's how it got its name, by the way. And then above the medulla is what's called the pons. So this is the primitive brain. So without the cerebrum, which is up on top, you can stay alive just using these areas down below. So in other words, on page 2 of your notes, go to page 2. It says medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is right here where it's oblong. Okay, it's kind of like, it's not evenly spaced, it's a little wider. So the medulla oblongata is D, and D is going to regulate heartbeat, respiration, vomiting, coughing, and sneezing. So that's basically medulla oblongata. And adjacent to that, almost looks like an almond, it's this little area right here. It's called the pons, and that's B, as in contains pneumotactic center. It aids in breathing or respiration. Works with medulla oblongata to control your breathing. So in other words, you can breathe and be alive with what's called the primitive brain. So the hemispheres are larger areas that developed and are found in higher forms of life on our planet. and each area has a different function. The next thing that we want to do is I've got half a brain. So this would be the left side. And then this would obviously be the right side. But let's take a look in here. And I'm going to use this side right here. Actually, I'm going to go back to the other one. Now that I fit it in, I think we'll just stay with this right side. All right, so we said spinal cord. What was that again? I forgot. Medulla what? Oblongata, Corey. Oblongata. Begins with P, pons, okay? Pituitary gland. See this little gland that sticks down here? On my notes, and actually in the multiple choice, it says pituitary gland F. F is what? An endocrine gland that secretes what? Hormones that control growth, human growth hormone, development, metabolism. My thyroid is affected by hormones produced here, my thyroid, and then homeostasis. I learned that this gland was the master gland. I learned this when I was in school. I won't tell you how many years ago, but it's more than 20, okay? And so they taught me wrong. Nicole, they told me that the master gland was the pituitary, and it's not. This area right above it is called the hypothalamus. Hypo means below the thalamus. And go to the hypothalamus on your page there that we're matching. Hypothalamus is J. And it says regulates autonomic nervous system, body temperature, hunger, and thirst. So the hypothalamus controls this. The hypothalamus is the master gland. Okay, isn't that interesting? So stuff that we're learning tonight is probably wrong, and maybe 100 years from now they'll correct it. Does that sound good, Jamie? Okay. All right. So if this is the pituitary where the little gland is, and that's the hypothalamus, above it is called the thalamus. Thalamus is a relay for sensory information going to the cortex. The cortex is up on top. So the thalamus is A, and it's sending sensory information to the cortex and crude what? Perception of touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. But it's going, so notice what we've got. Pituitary, hypothalamus, thalamus. This was the pons. Behind that is the midbrain. So on your sheet, it says midbrain, and midbrain is H. Contains what? H. Reflex centers for startle, auditory, and visual. So if I were behind Corey, and I wouldn't do this to you, Corey, but for the example, she's walking down the hall. I'm going to stop her and talk, and I'm going to have somebody come up behind her and drop 5 books on the floor. And she's going to jump up. And why is she going to jump up? Corey, you'll jump up because of what? That part is where you have what's called a startle reflex. And in order to be startled, what has to happen? You have to be able to hear it, right? And when you hear something behind you, like if you see a ghost or something like that, you jump. It's called the startle reflex. So if we're going and looking at that, let's go and midbrain is reflex for startle, and it's auditory and visual. So the only way I'm going to get startled is if I visualize something or I hear something. So you jump out of your skin. So that's the midbrain. Cerebellum is this area in the back, and it's for fine motor. So I've been watching my granddaughter, who is like 17 months now. She would just move her arms all over the place. But now that she's like 17 months, she's actually, my son tells her or asks her where her ear is. And occasionally she'll point to her ear now. So in order to do that, that's fine motor. And in order to do that, it has to be controlled with the motor cortex of the upper part of the brain. But for fine motor movements, you need to use your cerebellum. And the cerebellum has what is two sides to it. And if you'll notice that the term just below the very bottom, it says arbor vitae. Arbor vitae is the tree of life, and it's G. It's white tracks that run from one side of the cerebellum to the other, but it looks like a tree of life. Just take my word for it, tree of life. And its tracks coordinating fine muscle movement, okay? And so that was G. White matter tracks conduct impulses between the cerebellum for fine motor control. Which ones haven't we talked about? Well, we haven't talked about the cerebral cortex or lobes, and that's I. Specific centers that interpret sensory information, control muscle movement, center for emotion and intelligence. So that's I. So that's the top of your brain. So if we start looking at this area, then we're going to have different lobes that are going to have different what? Different functions. For instance, in the prefrontal area down here, frontal is like where your forehead is. Remember, on the skull, the frontal bone. Well, this is where the frontal part of your brain is. It says rational, logical, analytical, and it'll also say artistic, intuition, emotion. This is where your personality is. So your personality and your ability to learn is in the prefrontal lobe. The rest of the frontal lobe is actually going to be an area here, and it's let's say the top part of the frontal lobe is called the motor cortex. There's what's called a gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S, and these little individual depressions are called sulci, S-U-L-C-I, and they probably talk about them in lecture. But there's a gyrus, a central gyrus that separates frontal lobe from parietal lobe. So in the posterior top portion of the frontal lobe is motor. And the reason I remember that it's motor is because M comes before S. Motor, guess what's in the parietal? Sensory. So this is the primary motor cortex here, it's red. And then right behind it, it's in this lilac or purple color, is the primary central cortex. So just remember M is before S. It's the way I remember it. So the sensory cortex is in the parietal lobe, okay? Your vision or visual stimulation occurs in the occiput. Your hearing and I believe taste is in the temporal lobe. And we're going to go over, there's a sheet on this stuff that we'll go over in just a minute. All right, so what have I missed? I've missed
Ventricles.
Ventricles. So we got to open this up. And inside, actually, can you see like there's a little depression? I don't know if you can actually see it or not, but there's a little depression. That little depression is called a ventricle. And it's right here on this part. The ventricles are where we're going to make cerebral spinal fluid. So surrounding, running around the outside of the brain, and then in the spinal cord is a little canal. There's going to be like a little opening, but your spinal cord itself has fluid around it. The fluid is cerebral spinal fluid. It gives us nutrition, and it allows for shock absorption of your brain. Okay.
Does
And
it
so, go ahead.
also like internal temperature regulate the brain a little bit?
You know, it probably would control and have some effect on temperature if it's a fluid that's being produced.
Okay.
Okay. And so it's like a watery fluid, but what's in it is going to be sugar. So has anyone taken a test and you felt like your brain was froggy, like not froggy, but foggy? You know what I'm saying? Where you, oh, I can't think. It's because your sugar levels are so low. So in other words, your brain needs, last night I was trying to get this idea across about the brain needs oxygen in order to, because It's a very highly metabolically active part of the body. That's why it needs oxygen. And if
That's
you go,
why you feel funky at altitudes, because of the oxygen deprivation.
that would be a reason for sure, because you're not getting enough oxygen into the nervous system. And I asked a question last night about what happens to people who fall through like a frozen, the surface of a frozen lake and wind up at the bottom for 20 minutes. What do they tend to be able to do to them that they haven't been breathing? They're just laying there on the bottom. Somebody goes down, grabs them and pulls them out. And what do they do to them to bring them back? What do they have to do?
Well,
Well,
I would want to make sure they're warm.
Well,
Like,
they would warm them up and they would do what? Make sure they have oxygen. But when they were, when they were in that cold environment, what happened to the metabolic rate? What happens when you put a bear in a cave?
It slows down.
It's the heart rate does what? Slows down.
It's down. Mhm.
Yeah. So if you think about it, people will, fall through the ice and be underneath there for a while, and then they actually sometimes can revive them. But typically, what's it, like 7 minutes or so? 7, 8 minutes without oxygen, and you've done damage to your brain? I think
before you
so.
die,
Yeah, well,
it doesn't
you
take you
can,
that long.
well, parts of your
Become
brain
brain
could die.
dead.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you need oxygen and we need nourishment. That's why one of the most important things before you take like any of these tests is eat something, not just go jumping in. You're already nervous. Corey, we're already nervous. And I'm nervous for you because I had to make the test, right? That's true. You think I'm not nervous. I go and I look at the test on this last test. We actually, for those that took it, did rather well. I mean, a few had a bad day, but by far there were a lot of B's and A's, and that makes me happy that when you see that you guys are working, because the information is there. You just got to put it together. Okay. All right. The last part that we wanted to talk about after ventricles, we already talked about arbor vitae as the white matter tracts in the cerebellum for fine motor movement.
So is ventricle a C?
C for ventricle, yeah. And then arbor vitae was G, and corpus callosum. I'm going to say some things now that you ladies are going to like. Corpus callosum is a what? It's E. It's the white matter tract that conducts impulses between both what? Hemispheres. So this is the left hemisphere, and this would be the right. So connecting one hemisphere to the other, or these white neurons, they're actually a tract. So in women, this corpus callosum is well developed, so you ladies can multitask. So Kelly, I could give you 2 or 3 or 4 things to do at the same time, but if I had someone like Justin, I would say, or maybe Lance, I'd say I'm going to give them one thing. Why would I do that? Because you can multitask. And as men, we can only do one thing at a time.
In theory.
Well,
in theory.
and it depends on, there has to be a stimulation factor, just like if somebody wants to do something. But in other words, so in women, the corpus callosum is more well developed. It'll be thicker and wider. Does everybody follow? Okay. All right. So let's take a look now. And we got another page 3. So let's go ahead. And this is right from your notes. And I double checked it. Also in the lab is an old copy of a former lab number 10 that was done, just to check yourself, Corey. So let's talk about primary motor area. Remember, M was before S. It's in the frontal lobe, isn't it? So primary motor area is frontal lobe, and it controls muscle, skeletal muscle. So it'll control skeletal muscle, okay? Now, if you think about it, in order to control muscle, you use the primary motor area of the cortex and also the cerebellum, would you not? Nod your head, yes, because it's another area for what? Fine motor control, okay? So in other words, the motor area is in the frontal cortex and in the cerebellum, is what it is. Okay, the next cortical area is called somatosensory. Somato means body. So in other words, it's the sensory area for the body. And it's the primary sensory area for the body. And it's not in the frontal lobe, but it's just behind it in the parietal lobe. And it interprets sensation from the skin and the skeletal muscles. So it's taking sensation from the skin and skeletal muscles and sending it up, relaying it through, if we look at it, relaying it through the brain up to the surface of the brain to the cortex, which is up in here, okay? Visual area, which is the third one on our list, is again where? In the occipital lobe, which is in the back, okay? So that's for visual stimuli. So you see with your eyes, but the control and what you're interpreting this vision part is in your occiput, okay? And auditory, that's where my ears are. So auditory is temporal lobe, and it's recognizing sounds, pitches, and tones. And then I have a taste sensation that's gustatory, and it's in the inferior part of the parietal, and that allows me to taste. So it just says inferior part of parietal. So in the parietal, like inferior, taste, like your tongue tasting things. On this model, there is on the left side in the frontal lobe, Broca, B-R-O-C-A's speech area. Broca's, it's normally on the, it would be wherever the dominant side control is. Does everybody kind of follow? Okay, but let's take a look at what's going on. Sensation, if you read these notes in the medulla oblongata, let me read this to you because I want you to get the idea. Okay, under brainstem, it says medulla oblongata. This is in your lecture notes. It says heartbeat, breathing, superior to spinal cord. We said it was that oblong part just above the spinal cord. And it says also where what? Motor tracts from the midbrain cross, producing contralateral control of the hemispheres. Listen to this. It's where things cross over. So I'm dominantly right-handed, okay? And so where's control for the right side of my body? On the left. And so because it's motor, and it in that part there in the medulla oblongata, the motor or Broca's speech control is on the left frontal part. Do you see what I'm saying? So even though it's on the left, it's controlling what? The right side of my body. And what is it controlling? Well, Broca is controlling the ability of my muscles and my tongue and lips and my throat to make noises and make sounds. So when you listen to my granddaughter, she just makes kind of like, maybe she can do a dada or something like that. I haven't heard it, but you just kind of hear her squeal, you know, because she's just making noises. You know, she's only what, 17 months or whatever. So she hasn't really learned how to use Broca's speech area, has she? But you have to learn how to control your tongue, lips, throat, and muscles in order to form words and have some sounds that we can recognize. So everybody kind of follow? So in other words, it'd be on the left, and that would control my right side where I'm dominantly right-handed. So if somebody has what on their brain, let's say they have a stroke on the left side of the body, or left side of their brain, it will control or affect the what side? The right.
The right side.
Okay, so that's why we learn this about the brain. All right, olfactory is the next one, and that's in the temporal lobe. It says medial aspect, and olfaction is to be able to breathe, to smell odors and be able to smell. And then the last one that we have as far as cerebral areas is prefrontal cortex. So as I was mentioning before, our frontal part is right here where my forehead is, correct? And so when we're looking at that, This is where my intellect, my ability to learn, my personality, all of those are located. Okay. All right. So I think what we've done thus far tonight is gone over the 3 pages of your lab 10. And then what you want to actually do is go in and look at this, the images or slides. And I already put it in there where you can take the quiz multiple times, like double digit. All right. So don't be afraid to get in there and take it a few times. The way this class is going to work, there's 4 weeks in November. The first week we're in right now, so we're doing lab 10 this week. Then next week we'll be working on lab 11. The third week we're working on like lab what? 12. And then we have a week for Thanksgiving. Does everybody follow? And then at the very end, the last day, I believe is a Monday and Tuesday. So December 1st and the last day of November is going to be our third practical over these 3 labs. Okay. So when you're studying this material, you're already studying for the final is what you're actually doing. Okay. And so we should have enough lab quiz grades to drop 2. And then each of the practicals is, let's say 25%, and then the quizzes make up the other 25. But I'm looking for improvement. I'm looking for consistency. I'm looking for somebody, we had one person that I think jumped like 15 points or 20 points on the test. And I'm glad to see that, okay? Any questions with what you need to do?
On practical 3, is it going to be honor locked?
No, I'm trusting you. And I
other-
think, go ahead, question.
The other question I have is for the lab quizzes,
Right.
is that supposed to be due on?
I'd like them to be done by like this week, Monday and Tuesday night class. You
Okay.
should have it done by Monday, Tuesday next week. And it, because typically on Wednesday, I'm going to go in and take your grades because I think you or someone said, hey, they're not posted. Well, I'm waiting for everybody to get them in
Okay,
at one
I-
time. And then,
Okay.
so I know I could have had it set up, but if you look at the name of the quiz, it's like a pretest, wasn't it?
Mhm.
And so I have it set up where your practical grade, I can have it automatically go to gradebook. But I've been individually putting those quiz grades
Ooh.
down.
Okay.
And I keep them on the 2 sheets. Thus, I dropped, I didn't drop, they dropped themselves. We had 4 people in each class drop because they weren't working. And so if someone's not working, I put a little 0. It's like, hey, I didn't get a grade in there. And I can kind of see where everybody's at. But we're in the home stretch. And so
Right.
you're going to go ahead and actually it's going to help both of us. I put a good 35 questions together just on these 3 pages of material. And so there'll probably be about 100 questions, and of that we'll pull 50 for the practical is what we're going to do. All right, well, let me say one more thing. On the bottom, on the undersurface rather of the brain are what are called cranial nerves. And so there's 12 cranial nerves. So next week you get to learn cranial nerves, okay? And so I think playing with the cranial nerves is actually kind of fun, but maybe it's because I've been doing this too long, Corey. I think that's what's the problem, okay? So any other questions? Okay, if not, I'm going to go and upload this class and we'll put it into the YouTube. So this will be the one that we'll use for this week's Lab 10, and we'll go from there. And if there's no other questions, then go ahead and continue to work. There's some really nice pictures in your Ammerman or in some of the different textbooks that you have. But I think that when we come down to when you look at the images, those images that you have in Lab 10 are the ones I use to make your tests that'll be coming up. I didn't make your pre-test or the quiz. Someone else did that, but I'll be making up your test at the end, for practical 3. Okay. All right. Any questions? If not, I will see you next week. Be safe.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night.
You
Okay,
too.
thank you.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Can I talk to you real quick after everybody's done?
Yeah. Yes.
I just had one quick question.
Sure, Jamie.
Professor,
Go ahead. Go
What
ahead, Jamie.
location is the prefrontal cortex? I didn't catch that.
Oh, I lost vision with you.
Mhm.
But let me try this and see if this will get me back, okay? Let me try that. All right, here we are. Last night, I had the board and I hit the mouse with the board. And it took me from the visual screen where I see you guys.
Mhm.
And I was afraid that I couldn't find how to get back to the visual screen. So for the last 15 minutes, I talked about the brain and they didn't see the brain at all. So you guys are so lucky. So the prefrontal is down in this area. See, it says prefrontal right in here.
Okay.
It's where it is. And so one side is for artistic and one is for math and reasoning. There's different sides in that. Okay. And
Okay,
what's
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right,
Have
I'm
a
gonna
good
leave
night.
so you guys
Okay.
can talk. Thank you.
Keep working.
Thanks.
Okay, so I still have I have you with me. Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to make sure that, because I think I emailed you before that there was a death in my family, that
Yeah,
my
you
mother
did.
basically, yeah, she was on her way to dying, so she passed away Halloween, whatever day that was. And then I've had to make funeral arrangements and all that stuff at like the worst possible time. And so
Right.
I just want to make sure that I got everything current right now.
Okay, well, you know what? One thing you might want to do is go back on Lab 8.
Lab 8.
Yeah, you go back in. Well, why don't you, if you are so inclined, go back and do Lab 7, 8, and 9, and just let me know that you did it. So I have you for Lab
Okay.
7 as having 60. And
Okay.
then Lab 8 was 0, and then 9 was 70. So why don't you
Okay.
go back and redo those and get them up to 90s or 100s,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'll be okay. Okay. And so your 80 and 78's got you up into the, solid B.
Good.
But if I see vast improvement, and I know it's hard when you lose somebody in the family.
You know, yeah, it's I
hard.
would say this semester has been really awful.
Well, I'm back in the classroom, and unfortunately last night I was talking to somebody before my class saying, oh yeah, I'm really getting down how to do this stuff. And then I lost the visual with the class, and I'm like,
Jeez.
it's like, and I knew that I didn't want to, I was afraid to go in, and I've done that once before and I could get back to you guys, but
Mhm.
it didn't happen last night. So I'll be back in class for like the 2-hour set in the spring. And I'll have an anatomy, I have an anatomy 2 on Wednesday night and anatomy 1 Tuesday morning. But it's going to be interesting because I heard that they're going to have 24 students in the lab, but only 12 can be in the room at the same time. So that's making me think, why not just take the models and go up into the lecture room where most of these students came from to come to my lab anyway,
Mhm.
and talk about it. This is such and such, or this is so and so, or this is the heart. And then that way, we could spend like an hour and a half or whatever together, and you can come down and look at them. They just don't want people to get get the virus, and they're afraid that they're going to get sued. I know they are, which is understandable.
Oh, people get sued the school for that?
Well, if you get sick and you don't, do well, like you die,
Yeah.
so they want to make sure everybody is, is safe.
Funeral home is busy. I'll tell you, the funeral home was busy. When my mother passed, we had to wait think about 4 hours,
Wow.
4 or 5 hours before Cinnamon came out from the funeral home to take her out of the assisted living place and bring her to the funeral home.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we're planning, I got some of the funeral planned already, but we're planning it right now. And it's just like,
A lot of people are having it later, but if you have it
Yeah.
too much later, you know, it's hard. I know some people that
Like
I knew
half and
somebody for 20 years, and he knew he was dying. He had cancer,
Mhm. I'm so
and
sorry.
his brother spent like the last 6 months just palling around with him, and
Yeah.
and he died. And you know, I don't think they haven't had a funeral yet. So
We're having we're putting her in the ground. And so
Right.
we're having like a little service, but
Right.
we're actually doing it online. So
Oh.
so it's literally just going to be like myself, my brother, maybe a friend or two of hers, maybe. Because
Right.
my mom was a nurse, so they're all nursing friends, and
Right.
you know, with the virus, they know about spread. So
Yeah,
you know.
it's crazy. It's crazy. And so I think that, yeah, I had a nurse come into the office, and one of my patients walked in without having a mask on, and this lady about had a heart attack.
Oh wow.
And the
Yeah.
other, you know, and we require masks in the office. I mean, I've got
You have
them
to.
right there. But yeah, it is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So, okay. All right. So if you want, just
Okay.
give me a heads up, and I can upgrade your quiz grade on those, you know, those different labs for you. Okay.
Okay.
All
I
right.
will. Thank you very much, Dr.
All
Bird.
right. Take care. All right.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.